out, buddy! Look out! Hello and welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland and John McCManus. Welcome back. If you're a regular listener, if you're new, what you're going to get is us shooting the breeze about a topic of John's choosing today. And John is wearing a sweatshirt that says Army on it. So I think he's giving us a little bit of a clue as to what he wants to talk about.
The direction this conversation is going to head.
Possibly. John, how are you, first of all? The other side of the pond and all that?
I'm doing great. How you doing, Al?
I'm good. Have your clocks gone back?
Not yet.
What happened?
No, they'll go back this weekend, I think.
Right, okay.
It's confusing.
And John, you're about to head over to Europe, aren't you?
I am, yeah. I'm actually about to go to do the Normandy Send tour with the World War II Museum. So we do half that on the Joie de Vivre riverboat, along the Seine, and then half of it in Normandy at the Chenevier.
Ah, right.
Yeah, it's a blast.
I mean, there's always kind of favored places to go to in Normandy. I mean, where do you always like to kind of doff your cap to?
I'll tell you what.
Because I remember meeting you in Bayeux, didn't we? We had a
we met in Bayeux. That was a lot of fun, actually. Yeah, we nestled into this little coffee shop or something.
That's right.
And we jabbered on about Omaha Beach, which of course, once you wind me up with that, you'll never shut me up. I mean, obviously, as you found out. But you know what is one of my favorite places in Normandy is Abbaye d'Ardenne.
Yes.
That is a haunting place, and just just knowing a little bit about what went on there.
Yes, and you can picture Panzer Meyer, can't you, on his little, on the kind of turret. It is an old monastery, and it's got all that you would expect from a sort of a medieval French monastery with the outbuildings and the halls, and obviously the kind of the main church itself. That's where the 12th SS arrived, were arriving overnight, and where the headquarters of Panzer Meyer's regiment said, okay, this can be our headquarters, because I can get up into that tower, and from there I can look pretty much all the way back down to the sea.
Absolutely.
So I've got a great vantage point, and I can sort of control my battle, and he's sort of looking at it. And of course, you can't see the folds in the ground from there, but what you can see at that part of Normandy, just to the west, and the Abbaye d'Ardenne is, for those who don't know it, it's just north of Carpiquet, which in turn is kind of southwest of the city of Caen. So it's on that kind of western side. And it does command incredible views from up there at the top of the tower.
It does. It's beautiful.
There's a photo of him, isn't there? There's a photo of Panzer Meyer there.
There's a photo of him there, and just the whole vistas of it, the terrain around there, you can see for miles and miles and miles, and you can see how challenging that would be from an attacker standpoint, trying to move anybody or anything without being seen, especially by 12th SS, which has set up this kind of nerve center there in what had been a very venerable place. And of course, what happens there ultimately, tragically, the execution of POWs by the SS, and this blood feud that then ensues between Canadian 3rd Division and 12th SS Panzer.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking of other places that offer great views like that. It's the hills overlooking Mortain as well. Mortain-les-Bocages in the west of the west, towards the western end. I remember interviewing a guy who'd been calling fire missions in from on top of the hill.
Was that Robert Weiss?
Yes, it was.
Oh my God, he was amazing, absolutely amazing.
I don't know him. Tell me about him.
An incredible book called Fire Mission. Yeah, and he told us all about being up on that hill, and because you've got the Roman roads, and seeing the panzers come up the roads towards Mortain, and the view down onto it, and he described watching the counterattack going in and the battery fire going in, and basically stopping this offensive in its tracks. And he was such an amazing man, and an incredible guy, really tall and sort of powerful looking man.
A very dignified guy. He,
yes,
he's an interesting dude. He's all of 21 years old. He's almost brand new to combat. He's this upwardly mobile guy from Valparaiso, Indiana, the son of immigrants from Hungarian Jews, actually. And he calls in 193 fire missions in a 6-day period, one every 45 minutes. It's just, they put their batteries out in the sun, the radio batteries in the sun to keep them going. It's really quite a story. And it's like you can see everything up there. You can see all the way to Mont Saint-Michel on some days.
Yeah, you absolutely can. You can on a good day, can't you? What? So as a forward observer, a foo, as we would call it in the kind of in the UK. Al, you and I had that day on Salisbury Plain, didn't we? Where we were kind of forward observers and we were directing fire, and it was fascinating. But what's he doing? What's the process for this guy, or for any forward observation officer? How does it actually work? He's on his setup. He's got a radio, presumably.
Yeah, they have sophisticated radio equipment, which they're moving in a Jeep, and it's a pain in the rear to manipulate. So he's got that
because it's heavy. They're heavy, these things, aren't they?
It's really heavy. He's got a binoscope, in which he's sighting. He might just use binoculars, portable binoculars, but in this case, at 314, he's using the fixed equipment. He's got a 3-man team that works with him. Now he's a member of an artillery battalion. They're in the 30th Infantry Division, so. In the typical U.S. setup, by that time in World War II, you got 4 artillery battalions, 3 of which are 105s and 1 is a 155. And so what they do is the batteries parcel out, 1 forward observation officer with his team with infantry units typically. And I always argue that should be your number one target in combat is that guy, because he's controlling the real destructive firepower. And I think the example of Weiss is prime.
But is he doing guesstimates? I mean, say he's up on the hill, column is coming towards you. What is it? Kind of a mile and a half away, 2 miles away, something like that.
Roughly, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so 2 miles away. So he's saying bring it down on this grid point on a map. Is it?
Yeah, he's exactly. He's kind of guesstimating. You don't have like the Q-36 radar like you're going to have in the 21st century, but you've got. You have some pretty sophisticated computer style equipment. And by computer, I mean these tables and grids and of course, the radio equipment. I mean, it's more sophisticated than it ever been, but there's guesstimating. And Weiss happens to be very good at this.
Just judging distance
distance, knowing the terrain, pre-sighting fires. But also, I should say, in that instance, they took over for the 1st Infantry Division. They were kind of relief in place. So he's getting the coordinates. They had pre-sighted all the coordinates like you would when you're just in a fixed position. So he's got all that to draw from, and then he can see it actually whether it really works.
But John, just explain, for those who don't know, explain what that means, pre-sighting the coordinates.
Yeah, so if you're looking at those roads we were talking about, and you can imagine enemy vehicles moving on those roads.
Because you still need your arteries, right? You're canalized
Absolutely.
by the roads.
Yeah.
We're talking about Operation Lüttich, aren't we? Which is the gambling Mortain offensive that Hitler's decided he's going to destabilize the Allied effort, and so on. But I mean, if you put Mortain in, if you put it into Google Maps, you'll see the view from the hills. There's basically a plain down below you, north of you, with Avranches over to on your left, over to the west, and the whole thing laid out like a billiard table in front of you.
Yeah, right.
It's extraordinary, and so. Clearly, they had pre-sighted stuff. So you've got that crossroads is crossroads A, crossroads B is another one, and the guns.
But the pre-sighting bit is say there's a crossroads, kind of half a mile from where you are on the top of the hill by that little there's that little chapel, isn't there? And then you climb up the little steps, and there it all is. And you absolutely can see forever, and you can see Mont Saint-Michel and all the rest of it on a clear day behind you. But say you're looking forward to where Lüttich is coming forward, and you can see on your map there's a crossroads. What you mean by pre-working out, pre-aligning the coordinates is you've identified that crossroad as a potential kind of point to hit.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you've worked out the coordinate that it's 872941 on the map. That's your 94 one way, 84 the other, and then dividing that square in tens both ways.
And back at the batteries, they've already got that info. The batteries were about 3 miles to the west, something like that.
Yeah. So they know that already. So if you say crossroads, 84992.
Well, or crossroads Able, even, and they all know that it's that one. It's like what the Germans did in when they're defending, fighting the Canadians in Holland when it's all flooded. Is the reverse roofs of the houses had numbers on them, so that they painted numbers on the reverse roofs, so that you knew they're going for house 2, and you knew where to concentrate your machine gun fire. It's simplifying the fire missions. I mean, Weiss was amazing though, because he was up there 6 days. He said they ran out of water. The Germans had obviously tumbled that this piece of high ground was an excellent spotting place, and they were being attacked themselves. I think I remember him saying that the problem with the Jeep and all the kit was digging it in.
Exactly.
And so it's vulnerable. I think the Jeep was destroyed. You've got the issue of the if you you need your aerial up for the radio to work properly, which is obviously gives away where you are and all those things going on at once. And they were up there on their own, effectively in the German rear for a bit at the full extent of Lüttich. He was an amazing man.
He really was.
Quite extraordinary.
And they go in with 2 K-ration meals apiece or something.
That's right.
They're digging up rutabagas and other raw vegetables from farms nearby as this thing unfolds. The other thing too that ultimately is quite tragic that happens with Weiss on the last day before they're eventually relieved as the Germans are pushed east. A shell comes in and badly wounds Sergeant Korn, who was Weiss's second in command and kind of key guy. And in a normal circumstance, the golden hour, how you get to somebody quickly and you can save their lives. Well, he's just kind of bleeding out and they can't do anything for him. This plays out that morning. This is, I think, August 12th, 1944.
Right.
And then, it's not.
And he's gone by the afternoon.
And he's gone. And of course, this was, you can imagine how difficult that was for Weiss.
Well, I remember him breaking down when he was talking about on camera, like being incredibly upset by it. And that was 60 years later. That was in 2004 when we made that. It affected him profoundly. His book, it was terrific, though. It's very, very gripping read. It's called Fire Mission: The Siege at Mortain in Normandy, August 1944. It's a heck of a thing, and the view you get from there, having him standing there explaining that to us, was quite extraordinary.
I'm not surprised he broke down, though. I mean, it must be incredibly emotional to go back to these places. These places where you've witnessed so much drama, so much trauma. And then to be back on the same spot. And there's always that thing, isn't there, that, if it can be peaceful now, why did it ever have to not be?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a big fan of the then and now, sort of being able to... Because
I
think sometimes, landscape does change an awful lot and incredibly quickly, particularly when it's built upon. And if you go around Anzio now, there's kind of almost nothing left at all. I mean, you can just about go into the wadis, that's about it. But I mean, try and go anywhere else, the factory, cisterna, forget it. I mean, it's just, the underpass, the overpass, all that kind of stuff. All these places have just been consumed by building and light industry and it's sort of gone. It's gone forever, particularly when you look at the photographs and you see what a kind of sort of a totally kind of deserted landscape it was. And of course, the reason it was deserted was because it's only just been, it used to be a kind of sort of impenetrable marshland, and it's only just been kind of reclaimed in the 1930s. So it's all brand new anyway. So it's not surprising it's different. So then and now is great because it's lovely when you can go to places where they are recognizably one and the same place, and you can match it up and you think, God, I'm in exactly the same spot. And just below Mortain is that amazing now disused railway station. And there's plenty of photographs of this avenue of plane trees leading up to this railway station. And you can see all these sort of shot up German vehicles and half tracks and Kubelwagens and what have you. And you can line up that picture and it's absolutely one and the same. It's just amazing. Wow. And that's also very moving, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, it allows you to sort of experience it in your own way. Those of us who weren't there, seeing it then and now, and if it's not that different, then you do feel like you have a sense of this.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. So what were we going to talk about?
We've just done a classic.
Well, I'll tell you what.
An absolute classic.
It's funny because Weiss is an example of what we're talking about, because this is a guy who may not ever have ended up in the armed forces, and yet he becomes part of this kind of mobilized American military machine. He goes to college, I think, at age 16 or something like that. So obviously he's sort of officer material on that end of the scale. There are millions and millions of others who don't have that advantage. In fact, only 40% of those who served in the American Armed Forces had a high school diploma, believe it or not, in World War II. Yeah. So, but he's an example of how, here are these civilians who become very proficient soldiers within a reasonable amount of time. Because as of 4 years before that, you have an army the size of Romania's army.
17th largest army in the world, isn't it?
As of 1939 and 40. Yeah.
It's just, which it's sometimes hard to convey this because you've got to step away from the impression we have of the US military now, of it being, capable of sort of global interdiction basically anywhere it fancies. I mean, it is truly extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, you've just got to forget all about B-52s that can turn up anywhere you like.
Well, what it is, I mean, it's the sort of sustained permanence of that in our lifetime.
Yeah.
Yes. And so what had happened in U.S. history, you'd had two previous times when the country had built a massive military machine, the Civil War and World War I, but then it just dismantled it. It's like, okay, it's over, and we want nothing. Yeah. So like the Civil War Army, on the Union side is, 1.6, 1.7 million or something. And then by the late 1860s, you're down to about 26,000 soldiers or something crazy like that.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's kind of the same sort of phenomenon after World War I, between 4 and 5 million serve in World War I. And yet, of course, by 1939, as we said, you're 17th behind Romania in terms of sheer military size. So you talk about a serious underachiever, but it's by choice, because all the political aspects of this.
So for those who don't know, what happens? How do we get from 17th to, I don't know, I suppose second after the Soviet Union by the end of the Second World War? How on earth does that happen?
I always thought it was worse than that. I thought it was 19th, sandwiched between Uruguay and Portugal. But
no, I think it was right behind Romania. But it's still fairly pathetic.
The point is, it's very small. It's 189,000 or something, isn't it? In 1939, September.
It is, 1939. But the good news is what has been preserved is a cadre of really dedicated professional soldiers, and not just in the Army, but also in the Navy too. Professional folks who have stuck with it in a 20-year period that wasn't very good career-wise. But, the Eisenhowers, the Bradleys, the Pattons, the Eichelbergers, the Marshalls, they have stuck with it. So you have now an Army and a Navy that has enough military professionals to build into a real professional first-class citizen Army or Navy, but not so much that it's racked by careerism. So you end up with that kind of sweet spot. So what happens societally, of course, is a kind of a wake-up call. You'd already had, believe it or not, in 1936, a commitment, a sort of quasi-commitment by the Congress to build the beginnings of a two-ocean navy. So you have at least some foundation for that. But obviously, it's the war situation in 1940 that is just the complete game changer in the U.S., especially the fall of France.
But Roosevelt's effort predates that, doesn't it? So in the start of September in 1939, Marshall's made chief of staff, and they right then and there say, right, okay, we're going to have to get an army up on its feet, aren't we? And the Secretary of State for Defence isn't interested. So they're sort of having to do it.
But actually, it starts even earlier than that because he's already trying to get the Neutrality Acts reversed. And the Neutrality, and he partly does in the summer of 1939, and then takes him a further level in the I think it's November, isn't it? 39. He gets a sort of second
with the cash and carry. Yeah, I mean Roosevelt never liked the Neutrality Acts, but he had to bend to the political realities, and they're passed from 1935 to 37 typically. But there's such an interesting dynamic. We should
explain what the Neutrality Acts are, though. We should explain what they are.
Yeah. So here's the background of that. You'd had like around 1935 Senate hearings, and what's interesting in the dynamic of this is that the key figure in these hearings is a guy named Gerald Nye, who was a Republican in a heavily Democratic-dominated Senate. And the hearings are all about the dirty laundry of U.S. entry into World War I, all the sort of economics and the bankers with loans to the Allies and all this kind of stuff about how, we had sort of fought for the bottom line of Wall Street at a time when Wall Street is really unpopular during the Depression. And the idea that we had just fought for, to further the British Empire or the Japanese Empire, all this kind of stuff. And so this disillusionment sets in that ultimately leads Congress to want to take action to say, let's make sure this never happens again. So to boil the Neutrality Acts down, it's basically Americans are prohibited from sailing on the ships of nations at war, and that you're not going to have any more loans to nations at war, no arms sales, that if they want to buy anything, they have to pay immediately up front, no problem.
Although American finance is still very active in Europe and the rest of the world. So you've withdrawn militarily. The US has withdrawn militarily from the world.
Oh, yeah.
But in terms of, because, this is the argument about American finance in Germany being a big part of the sort of Germany's problem as it manifests itself.
With the Dawes plan.
So you've with the Dawes plan. So you've got this sort of two-handed thing going on. Does some of it border on conspiracy theory about wicked bankers and
it does
that sort of stuff?
Oh, absolutely. Right. It does.
It absolutely does.
It's the good old American game of conspiracy and disillusionment. I mean, a 1937 Gallup poll revealed that 70% of the public felt involvement in World War I had been a mistake. 70%. That's a huge majority in the U.S. Such a fractious country, and and we'd lost 110,000. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot from a British perspective, and I get that. But the thing to remember is almost all these lives are lost in about a 9-month period. Yeah. That leaves a mark, especially when it's not for your own soil. It's not happening just across the English Channel where you're like, hey, this is important to us. It's somewhere overseas. Yeah. So the U.S., I think, in my opinion, had kind of abrogated and almost kind of betrayed its allies from World War I, because there was supposed to be a mutual defense pact with Britain and France. That the U.S. basically decides, no, we're not doing that. So both these countries then had to kind of, improvise in the next 20 years in relation to their security, because they had hoped that the U.S. would be part of their security system in the way you're going to have after World War II when you have NATO. Because then, things had changed. But so all of that had sort of set these events in motion, that lead to the Neutrality Acts and this sort of But the interesting thing, too, from a U.S. perspective, there's disengagement from Europe, but we're still really involved the way we always had been in the Western Hemisphere. Right. We're involved in Nicaragua and Honduras and, of course, in China, beyond the Western Hemisphere and all that, too. So we were picking our spots in a way. There was still plenty of dollar diplomacy going on, but just not in relation to Europe. Yeah.
I mean, certainly the British Foreign Office policy is, the idea is not to antagonize America, because America is actually the one power with maritime power to interfere with the running of the British Empire. And that they get very hung up on that at one point, that the last thing we can do is whatever we do, we have to keep America on side one way or another. So the idea that America's drifted away from that ideal, it is causing a lot of uncertainty, which is why in the end Churchill is so desperate to get America on side, because part of the thinking is, what threat does America constitute to the empire, as much as how useful an ally would it be, and its absence as an ally constitutes a threat, which is how the thinking's going in the interwar years, which I think which illustrates sort of a British understanding of American potential power in the long run, but perhaps not an appreciation of American internal politics.
Well, yeah, I mean, Roosevelt gets to power in 1932 on an isolationist ticket, and then there's this, as you're saying, this whole thing about big business and being, having blood on their hands and all the rest of it, and that's when you get the Vincent Trammell Act in, and that's one of the biggest headaches. Trying to unpick this, because the Vincent Trammell Act basically means if anyone wants to do a prototype of a new tank, for example, they've got to do it out of their own money, and they're not going to be paid back for 16 years, even if it's commissioned. And this is a major problem, because why would anyone?
Why would anyone do?
Why would anyone do it?
Right,
right. But that is precisely to stop it. And there's so all these companies like DuPont, really famous companies, they're no longer making TNT or explosives in the US because they've been shouted down and it's seen as aggressive and warmongering and all the rest of it. So they just don't do it. So there's no one really producing explosive, apart from just a little bit of engineering explosive, in the US in 1939 or 1940, early part of 1940. And you've got the Vincent Trammell Act, which is all part of the kind of Nye Committee recommendations, isn't it? I think I'm right in saying that. And so this Vincent Trammell Act is an absolute nightmare, because you've got to unpick that before you can start getting big business involved. And what Roosevelt is being told by his, what's it called, the War Defense Advisory Body or whatever it's called, I can't remember, that he sets up with these $1 a year men. This is Stetness and Bill Knudsen and people like that, and Nelson as well.
Donald Nelson, yeah.
Donald Nelson, of course.
Mhm.
But these guys are all going, well, what you need to do is you need to harness big business. And the problem is how do you harness big business? Because there's still this kind of mistrust in kind of, wider
big time.
politics, in the corridors of Washington, but also in the wider public. And you've got this legislation which prevents you from doing that. All of that has to be unpicked before they're in any position to do anything about it.
Yeah. And it all eventuates, I think, from this, or stems from this disillusionment, this kind of this bitterness over involvement in the war and determination never to have it happen again. I mean, that's the thing.
Right.
It's really quite striking when you look at a lot of the political discourse and some of the kind of popular media in the mid to late 30s, how adamant many people are that they're never going to get involved in a foreign war, especially in Europe, and especially among young people. And you'll see, too, some of the older generation preening on about how young people today aren't tough. They won't fight. This generation isn't going to fight. And it is so funny when we look at it now, we're like, now we call them the greatest generation. So here's a classic example. And this is the one that is just so mind-blowing. At Princeton University in the late 1930s, there was a kind of sardonic kind of poke fun at war-related thinking and internationalism movement called the Veterans of Future Wars. You guys heard of this?
Yeah.
So
it's such an interesting thing.
It is. Yeah. So you'd had the bonus marchers, quite tragically, during the Depression. These were military veterans who wanted to advance on the benefits the government really did owe them. And of course, that had gotten very ugly, during the end of the Hoover administration and so on and so forth. So these guys, these college students, in this parody, they're saying, hey, I guess we're going to be in future wars anyway, and we're going to get killed. So why not enjoy our benefits now? So please give us our benefits as veterans of future wars. And they thought it was just a lark. Well, they get all these contributions, thousands and thousands of dollars from people all over the country. And they didn't know what to do with it. They had to stand up this new committee and create a whole organizational structure. They got all sorts of media coverage that they never expected. And again, this is the so-called greatest generation or whatever. But that's the mindset at that point.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Amazing. That.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take a very quick break and we'll be back for more. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland and John McManus. Now, John, obviously there's an election to fight in 1940 as well, whilst trying to assemble an army in the wake of the strategic earthquake in May, June 1940 in Europe, and also an eye to what might be happening in the Far East. Are these things that happen in the summer of 1940 enough to convince American public opinion that America needs to sort of reboot its military? Or, as you go into the election at the end of the year, Roosevelt's still having to wear two hats, isn't he? He's still having to say to the people like Marshall, don't worry, we'll get this army on its feet and we'll end up conscripting people in the end. And then he's also having to play the politics for an election of we're not going to get involved in a war. So how on earth does he do that?
Yeah,
what the hell's going on?
I hate to be cynical, but he out and out lies. I mean, he in the campaign in 1940, he basically says, "I will not send your boys off to fight in any foreign wars." It's funny because in my U.S. military history class, I say, it's kind of ironic because Wilson runs in 1916 on the plank. He kept us out of the war. 6 months later, we're in the war. Roosevelt in 1940 says, I'm not getting involved in any foreign wars. And of course, we all know what happens next. And then Johnson in 1964, when he's running for election, says, I'm not sending your boys 8,000 or 10,000 miles away to, do what Asian boys ought to be doing. And of course, presto, we're in the war with escalation very much the next year. So what's happened in 1940 is obviously, the tectonic shift of France going down and Britain under siege and all this has led to at least a very, 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 very slim majority saying, let's prepare just in case. And so it's actually quite remarkable because, you'd only had a draft 2 times previously in this country's history, and that was during war. This is the first peacetime draft, and it barely passes. Yeah.
But there's a few things he's doing in 1940 which is kind of easing his way, because it is one of the biggest political volte-faces around. And one of the pieces, one of the things he's done is he's also done back in 1939. And what I think is really, really interesting about Roosevelt, it's absolutely clear that sometime before war breaks out, and really after the Munich crisis, he starts to kind of really start to twig, that realizes that it's not going to be much longer that the Atlantic is the great barrier that it once was. The one day in the not too distant future, America could be imperiled by, a European superpower such as the Nazi state, for example, should it come be. So he's starting to think about this. And one of the things that he gets passed in April 1939 is the Administrative Reorganization Act. And this is a genius piece of politicking, because he's been haggling about this for a couple of years, and eventually he's just he's bullied and bored people into kind of agreeing to it. And it seems like a minor bit of kind of tedious paperwork. But actually what it does is it gives him, as president, the authority to move a number of organizations out of the oversight of Congress and into his own personal fiefdom. And so there's stuff that are barriers once it comes to warmongering and kind of building up your rearming. You can just swiftly just go, okay, well, I'm not going to put that under the kind of, the executive office of the president, which is what's created out of this Administrative Reorganization Act. And that definitely helps him when it comes to getting the Vincent Trammell Act rescinded, because it's just stuff he can clear out of the way. The other thing he does, which I think is really, really smart, is he gets rid of the Democrats. It's Woodring, isn't it, who is the Secretary of State for War, and Edison, who is the Secretary of State for the Navy, the two biggest military jobs were, political jobs within the military. And, on his cabinet, for want of a better phrase, his administration. And he replaces them with Republicans. Henry Stimson, who's a legendary figure, he's in his 70s by this point, but an absolute sort of byword for kind of sort of probity, good sense, long service,
public
honesty,
service. Yep.
All that kind of stuff. He's played a big part in the previous war as well. And Frank Knox at the Navy. So in other words, by the time he's going to the election, he's got two Republicans already in the top spot. So what you're voting for is you're not really voting on a kind of Republican Democratic ticket. You're voting on who you think is going to be best to kind of sail you through the choppy waters that are ahead. It's about as close as you're going to get to the American equivalent of a nationalist government. Or am I overstating that, John?
No, I think it's exactly what he's done. Is he has basically brought the especially Eastern but internationalist side of the Republican Party into his tent, and so this then combines with already a pretty potent part of the Democratic Party, the internationalist side, that then kind of co-opts the Southern Democrats, who tend to be a bit more isolationist as well. And so it creates at least a majority coalition at this stage. And he had, of course, Roosevelt had been in the Wilson administration. He'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he'd seen how Wilson ultimately had been consumed by the partisanship of the era because he hadn't involved the Republicans quite enough, especially with the whole League of Nations fight.
Right.
So he was trying to learn from that mistake, and I do think it was a genius move in that sense. And Knox, too, was a particularly important figure because he was a media maven, a newspaper owner, so an opinion shaper on that level as well. That was a smart move.
That's like bringing Beaverbrook in, isn't
exactly.
It is. It's exactly like that.
I mean, the thing is Roosevelt fortunate in that in the late 30s, the Republicans, have lost a couple of times to him and are sort of in disarray and can't find an answer to
but they are on the presidential level, but at the
that's what I mean. Yeah.
At the gubernatorial and congressional level, there's a kind of potent anti-New Deal coalition that's really gaining momentum by the end of the decade. But yeah, the Republicans don't necessarily have a figure who can stand up to him on a national level. But also, the other unprecedented thing besides a peacetime draft, a guy running for a third term. I mean, that had been the tradition since George Washington, not a law, but a tradition that you would serve your 2 terms and then you'd bow out. And everybody previously had done that. Grant flirted with the idea coming back and running again. Teddy Roosevelt tried to run again, but he, hadn't served 2 full terms. So, I mean, that also showed you that there was a radically different kind of circumstance in which Americans would even accept. And really the idea was, well, Roosevelt is the steady hand. You want to manage this international crisis now. Yeah.
So there's an acknowledgement by that point that there is a proper international crisis coming. the one way or another, America needs a more robust angle on it.
Exactly.
And that's what's to come. But then of course.
But hang on a minute, because what he's also done, the other condition he's got by November 1940 is he's got a situation where the majority of the population are in favor of supporting the Allies. So in other words, supporting them in rearming, because how he's pitched it is if we can rearm, then we can give give the friends of democracy lots of arms, and therefore we won't have to fight because they're doing it for us on our behalf. So we're effectively paying mercenaries, and in one way, a very crude way of looking at it, to do the job for us. That's what we're doing in Ukraine, for example. It's exactly the same process. So we're all in favor of giving rockets and tanks to Ukraine because they're democratic and Putin's Russia isn't, and other democracies. So obviously. But that's so that we don't have to get involved, and that's exactly how it's sold. So suddenly, by November 1940, he's got absolute legendary Republicans and press barons in his administration, despite being a Democrat. He's got huge budgets to go through Congress and being passed, so he's got the money to spend. He's set up he started to rearm in a really big way, which we know, but which he knows by that point. More than 50% of the population are in favor of, and substantially more than 50% by November 1940. So it's kind of, the path is pretty clear. But all this has been done because fundamentally, after Munich, he has twigged that America USA faces an existential threat that needs resolving, and he's got himself into a bit of a pickle because of isolationism and the New Deal and all the rest of it. But the genius of FDR is that in 2 years, he's totally unpicked it. He's unpicked his situation from the fall of 1938 to the fall of 1940. The path is then clear, and in a way, the election is like it's not quite a rubber stamp, but it's not far off it, is it?
He wins a comfortable victory, but there's opposition to him. Wendell Willkie is a pretty decent candidate.
And then 1941 is no easy ride, is it? Though,
not at all.
You've drafted an army,
strikes galore.
Why are they in the army? They don't know, because America still isn't involved, and this thing hasn't come to pass yet. You've got people coming to the end of their time they're serving, and then of course, and the army's having to comb through standards and figure out actually how to expand, and how you run your regiments, and how you train your officers, and how you integrate the National Guard into the way you're doing things, if you do at all. How you even run the entire thing and keep people motivated, because they're sat around with no war to fight. And things get quite stagnant, don't they, within the army in the middle of 1941, and sort of look like they're going to unravel, don't they? Quite dramatically. I mean, to say the least, in fact. And then there are cover-ups and stuff and all that sort of stuff, that kind of stuff going on in 1941, aren't there? I mean,
it's classic growing pains.
It's a very odd, exactly. It's a very odd year.
It is
for the U.S. Army.
Yeah, and so you're drafting mainly 19 to 26-year-old single guys for a year, and then they're supposed to be in the reserves after that. Of course, what happens to most of them is they're in for the duration plus whatever, and that's another thing that's completely different than before and after in American military history. The idea that you're just in it as long as we need you. That is very rare, and it recognizes this kind of existential crisis. And the nightmare scenario is if Hitler gets his hands on the French fleet, but also the Royal Navy too, and then what happens? Or if he comes up with a bomber that can hit the U.S. or whatever. So the big argument by 41, in a way, is we realize we don't have much stuff, and it's going to take a long time to train this army and to kick in the mobilization and all that. So the question is, should we husband what we already have for ourselves and figure our allies in Europe are going down regardless, and we hang on to our tanks and planes and all this to defend ourselves, or should we give them to Britain, to help defend themselves? And of course, famously, the actual ambassador to Britain, Joe Kennedy, is like, the hell with the British, they're going down. Don't give them this stuff. And he's very out of step, of course, with the Roosevelt administration, which has started to embrace Lend-Lease. And that's really, I think, the key moment for the United States, in this whole story, because once you've gone down the Lend-Lease pathway, you're getting in the war. The neutrality acts are gone. I mean, you've done the cash and carry thing and basically bankrupted Britain that way. You're going to have to give them stuff if you want them to fight the war. You're going to have to get it there. which then brings up the old thing about the U-boats in the Atlantic and that tension. But I should also point out, too, you have what's thought of as an existential crisis in Asia Pacific, too, because China is central to the entire American wartime or even peacetime vision. If the balance of power is upset on the Asian continent and the Japanese get their hands on major resources, that's a serious game changer there, too. So lend-lease to China, too, is part of this dynamic as well.
Yeah, and all the time you have no forward-looking glass. I mean, you've got to just make the judgments that you're making with the information you've got to hand, but you have no idea how the war's going to play out. You have no idea whether China's savable, whether Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader in China, will come up trumps or not. You have no idea at this point. I mean, you can make a good educated guess and stuff, and you can, pore over the data, etc. But you don't know that. You're making these massive obsessive in real time, aren't you?
Yeah, and constantly changing too. I mean, the situation is constantly changing because, of course, 1941. Obviously, then the Soviets get into the war, and that sort of expands the horizon somewhat too. And then you have the back and forth with Britain and the road link into China and all that business too that kind of goes back and forth. You've got the diplomacy, wondering whether the Japanese are going to go war against the Soviet Union. Eventually, they have their non-aggression pact, and so it's just a fascinating thing. In the meantime, the Lend-Lease Act, as of March 1941, has basically made the U.S. a combatant in almost everything but name. But I think the average person, though, in this country doesn't quite see it that way. And so Pearl Harbor just seems to come out of the blue to a lot of people, like, we're just minding our own business, and the Japanese decide to attack us. And so that's good for the politicians in the sense of like, okay, get all fired up now, but this road to war has been much more obscured in that sense.
I mean, that in itself says something very interesting about how much attention people actually pay to international relations, how much actually people read the papers or follow what's going on or keep abreast of
that's
stuff,
a really good point. How news literate are Americans?
I mean, probably more than most human beings throughout history by that point in time, but in relation to really knowing the ins and outs of everything we're talking about here today, I would say not very. But most everybody, the thing that I remember, about talking to that generation when, and not even necessarily people who fight in the war, but people who were kids at the time or whatever, who are about the age of our parents or whatever. I mean, they'll say, what I remember about when Pearl Harbor was attacked, we were doing X, Y, Z, but then everyone asked, where's Pearl Harbor? What's that? And that is that's the biggest question usually, and I think that's very revealing because they wouldn't have known that the fleet had moved from San Diego to Pearl Harbor the year before as a kind of warning to the Japanese, but as it turns out, makes it more vulnerable.
Yeah, God, that's I mean, that's kind of like no one knowing where the Falklands was in 1982, isn't it?
I don't know where it is or what it is, but absolutely, I'm all for it. We've got to kick out the RGs.
Well, that's it. But that's exactly it. That's exactly the same.
How dare they?
That's extraordinary. Let's reconvene to carry on talking about this extraordinary moment in American history. We will see you next time. Thank you so much for listening. Cheerio.
Cheerio.